August 30th, 1915, the near half a hundred riders found their quarry of 5 horse thieves. In the posse were members of the Texas Rangers, the 13th Cavalry Regiment, marshals, and others who had been sent by Texan rancher Dick Love. Mr. Love claimed the 5 had arrived at his estate and compelled his servant to both feed the bandits and also rob Love of several horses. The bandits were now encamped in a canyon in West Texas, near the Van Horn Mountains and El Paso. The outlaws had dismounted, hitching their horses. The parties had encountered each other hours earlier in the day, exchanging gunfire, though neither side suffered a scratch. Though losing sight, the lawmen eventually followed the horse thieves' trail by tracking. After locating the 5 men, the determined pursuers held and aimed their guns for the ambush, any chance of mercy withdrawn after the earlier confrontation. The element of surprise and readiness aided the lawmen for the gunfight that followed. By the time the sun had lowered, all the bandits were dead, with no losses for the attackers. However, when the bodies of the 5 men were wagoned into town, the identity of one caused a stir. The one corpse that captured public and international attention was that of Pascual Orozco. He had been a lauded Mexican revolutionary and general to his followers, the Orozquistas, but to many other Mexicans he had become a vile traitor who had been in conflict with many of his former comrades in arms. Why and how had this former bastion of Mexico's revolution wound up dead in Texas? Well, find out on this episode of Historical Detour. Be sure to like and subscribe for more history off the beaten path. Consider joining my Patreon for exclusive perks. Comment any suggestions you would like to see covered. Born 1882 in the small community of San Isidro, Pascual Orozco Vázquez was raised at a point in Mexican history defined by one man, Porfirio Diaz, a successful military commander who fought against French occupation in Mexico. After a series of political coups against rivals and presidencies by allies, Diaz eventually held the office of president for decades and reigned as a de facto dictator of Mexico. Diaz centralized power, dissolving the semi-independently run haciendas or properties held by the Catholic Church, native communities, and political opponents. Under Diaz, Mexico's economic policies increasingly became influenced and dominated by foreign investors and companies. While these investors brought beneficial infrastructure such as railways and communication lines, the wealth generated by these projects was not distributed evenly to Mexican society. Very little of it went to Mexico's lower classes, and much of the wealth generated either went to the foreign companies' investors or Diaz lackeys. Amidst the regime of Diaz, Pascual was raised in a middle-class household in the Mexican state of Chihuahua. The state was an economic bastion in northern Mexico with a large industry of cattle and mines of precious metals such as gold, silver, lead, iron, and zinc. By the time he was out of his teenage years, Pascual had married and begun transporting metals for the various foreign mining companies. He led mule trains throughout northern Mexico. Though laborious work, it was quite financially lucrative. By the time of the Mexican Revolution, Orozco was a wealthy business owner in the same vein of his father, also possessing many foreign contacts north of the border in the U.S., especially Texas, which would prove useful in acquiring arms and munitions. His personal politics and ideology were largely opposed to the Diaz regime. In early adulthood, he read and was influenced by the Mexican anarchist Ricardo Magón. He believed in major democratic, labor, and land reforms that were stifled by the Diaz regime, in particular nationalizing the resources of Mexico to be back in Mexican hands so that the wealth division did not cause crippling poverty to the peasants. Additionally, his family were rivals to local Diaz supporters, not aiding in attracting them to the regime. Pascual prioritized the well-being of northern Mexico, particularly his home state of Chihuahua, rather than the rest of the country, as would be shown in the conflicts to come. In late 1910, a seismic shift began. Porfirio Diaz, at nearly 80 years of age, had once again won the predetermined and rigged presidential election the summer of that same year. However, the major rival candidate, Francisco Madero, had proven so popular with his promises of reform to the Mexican people that Diaz had Madero jailed to stifle dissent. Escaping confinement and finding safety in El Paso, Texas, Madero and his allies drafted the Plan of San Luis Potosi. It called for a revolution to overthrow the Porfiriato on November 20th, 1910, and hold new, free, and fair presidential elections. Abraham Gonzalez, governor of Chihuahua, would throw his lot in with Madero and recruited many prominent men into the rebellion, including Orozco and Pancho Villa. Pascual and many of his family would heed this call to action, organizing the initial groups of rebels who would be first and foremost loyal to Pascual and become known as the Orozquista faction. While many in the initial rebellion were suppressed by the Porfiriato soldiers and police, the rapidly growing band of rebels personally commanded by Pascual saw success in West Chihuahua. Within a month, the Orozquistas had captured territory from Mexico and defeated professional army units in open battle. So popular were the Orozquistas that many of the Chihuahuan civilians provided not only food to the rebels, but also intelligence on the enemy forces. The army of Orozquistas were continually portrayed as country bumpkins, dismissed as amateur irregular fighters, with the writer Cala Diaz Barrera haughtily remarking that the Orozquistas were, quote, an army of rags, without money, without any notion of military discipline. Their successful ambushes of military columns and siege operations cast doubt on that presumption. In addition, while lacking a standardized uniform, many fought under red flags, earning them the sobriquet of Colorados. In fact, it was Pascual that first formally issued a public reprimand to President Diaz from the new revolutionary government, nominally headed by Madero. Pascual warned the regime that, quote, although we love peace, we do not want the peace of slaves, because without individual liberty, there is no freedom in the nation. Other revolutionaries such as Pancho Villa would take prominent roles in leading the revolution in Chihuahua. However, during this early phase, it was informally accepted that Orozco was the lead military revolutionary of Chihuahua. Despite brief setbacks from well-armed Federale contingents, the Orozquistas maintained cohesion and gave battle. Ambushing train cars laden with military supplies helped sustain the rebels of Pascual. Pascual could have quite a dark and mocking sense of humor, reportedly having delivered a message to Diaz which was accompanied with the bloodstained uniforms of his army. The message read, quote, here are your wrappings, send me more tamales. The Diaz-appointed governor to replace Abraham Gonzalez offered a pardon to Orozco if he and his forces surrendered. Suffice to say, this offer was not accepted. By early 1911, Madero had arrived back in Mexico from Texas. Madero, despite his skill as a political motivator of the revolution, was an incompetent military commander. Madero threw his forces in a doomed assault at Casas Grandes, suffering dozens dead and many supplies lost. Soon after, a temporary ceasefire was declared. However, hostilities began again by early May 1911. Madero, seeing Orozco as one of the revolution's preeminent military leaders, along with Pancho Villa, formally promoted the guerrilla leader to brigadier general. Soon after this promotion, however, dissent from Orozco made itself apparent. When besieging Ciudad Juarez alongside Pancho Villa, Orozco ignored orders from Madero to retreat from the city, as Madero was concerned of accidentally causing damage to El Paso, Texas, just across the border. Orozco, however, ignored these orders. He simply replied to some effect, I will not call my men back. On the contrary, I am going to reinforce the line of fire. End quote. The city was ultimately captured and aided in shattering federal forces in the north. Despite Orozco's posthumous reputation as little more than an upjuck bandit, he gave orders to halt plundering of the city and for the civilians to be respected. Pancho and Orozco also feuded with Madero as to what to do with the captured general Juan Navarro, who had previously summarily executed captured revolutionaries. Eventually, they allowed Navarro to remain in custody and be given trial. The victories against Diaz in the north by Orozco and Villa, alongside the rebellion in the south led by Emiliano Zapata, eventually forced Diaz to give up the struggle and go into exile in France by May 1911. His words before leaving Mexico would prove prophetic. Quote, Madero has unleashed a tiger, now let him see if he can tame it. End quote. Although the Porfiriato had ended, years of domestic strife and violence would erupt again very shortly after, with Orozco at its center. New presidential elections were held, and Madero handily won the popular vote. However, his actions and agenda as president turned many of his former revolutionary supporters against him. Madero kept many Diaz supporters in administrative and legislative roles, not wishing to destabilize the country. Madero even dismantled the revolutionary armies that had brought him to power. Additionally, many promised or expected land, social, and political reforms were either scaled back or never materialized. Rather than receiving grand promotion or rewards for his pivotal role in the revolution that put Madero in Mexico City, all that was given to Orozco was command of the provincial police in a section of Chihuahua. However, Orozco would soon be tasked by Madero in putting down not one, but two anti-Madero rebellions in northern Mexico in late 1911. There was relatively little bloodshed in both cases. At points, the revolters even laid down their arms as they could trust Orozco to honor surrender agreements, and both conflicts ended in a matter of weeks. By early 1912, Orozco had formally broken away from Madero politically and even refused presidential commands to help suppress the revolt of Emiliano Zapata that had ignited once again in southern Mexico. In March 1912, Orozco revolted, leading not only the Orozquistas but other groups disaffected by Madero in Chihuahua. Supplies for Orozco were smuggled from the U.S. by arms dealers in preparation for the revolt. Thousands joined the revered Pascual Orozco. He also issued his defining manifesto, the Plan Orozquista, a stunning indictment against Madero, which argued Madero had failed in installing revolutionary changes he promised and ruled no more differently than Porfirio. The initial Madero loyalist campaign against Orozco was commanded by José Salas, who led the several thousand-strong División del Norte. Initial encounters favored the Orozquistas, climaxing in the First Battle of Rellano in late March. Using a train laden with explosives, the Orozquistas caused several casualties and frightened the División del Norte. With mounting losses, the morale of the División del Norte plummeted. Fearing mutiny and feeling hopeless, Madero's commander Salas took his own life. A new military commander soon replaced Salas. His name was Victoriano Huerta. Huerta had served in the Mexican army for decades, gaining a reputation for murderous ruthlessness and effectiveness in crushing dissent in previous conflicts against Mexico's indigenous peoples. Suffering from numerous ailments and the ravages of alcoholism, Huerta had been retired for several years before being asked by Madero to lead a campaign against Orozco. Huerta's federal army and auxiliary forces commanded by Pancho Villa rapidly defeated the Orozquistas, and Pascual himself was wounded by late 1912. With few options, Orozco fled to the U.S., briefly settling in Los Angeles, California, with relatives. However, he would return shortly with the aid of an unexpected ally. Trouble was brewing in Mexico City in February 1913. A grand conspiracy of former Diaz officials with the aid and approval of U.S. Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson was put into motion. The Diaz officials wanted to retain their former unchallenged authority, while both Germany, the United States, and other countries desired a new Mexican leader more neatly aligned with the uncontested ownership of Mexican resources and business interests. After several days of fierce fighting, Victoriano Huerta turned coat and joined the pro-Diaz faction. After capturing Madero and with the approval of the U.S. ambassador, Huerta assumed the presidency and ruled as an iron-fisted tyrant. Executing Madero and others, Huerta sought a potential ally across the border in Los Angeles. Huerta recognized that though a former enemy, Pascual held experience and influence in northern Mexico, and they had only clashed in the past due to the now-deceased Madero. Huerta's agents offered Orozco not only promised reforms to benefit Chihuahua, but also high military authority as a full general. Orozco accepted these terms. Huerta was in need of allies as Madero loyalists and anti-Huerta groups had risen in armed revolt, forming the Constitutional Army. Among their commanders was Pancho Villa. Meanwhile, the Zapatistas were still in revolt. When Orozco returned to the fight, he performed initially admirably as a division commander under Huerta, scoring several victories against the Constitutionalists. Eventually, however, mounting military losses against Orozco in northern Mexico and other areas of the country forced Huerta and Orozco to flee to America by July 1914. Though once again in exile, Orozco attempted to return to his homeland once again. From El Paso, Texas, he began international intrigue. Huerta met with German officials in New York who promised finances and weaponry. The Germans wanted a friendly Huerta regime to open a war front against the U.S. if it joined the Entente in World War I. With guaranteed German support, Huerta traveled to Orozco in El Paso to begin final preparations to regain power. They would be stopped, however, by U.S. customs agents who had heard of the plot. Huerta and Pascual were arrested for intrigue against the U.S. and violating U.S. neutrality. Though put under house arrest, Orozco escaped confinement. He would be accompanied by 4 loyal Orozquistas who would meet their ends at the hands of the posse who were hunting them for horse thieving. Orozco never made it back to Mexico and died an undignified death in the U.S. on August 30th, 1915. The body of Pascual was dressed in his general's uniform gifted to him by Huerta. His wife and over 3,000 mourners showed up to his funeral and burial in El Paso. Huerta died of liver failure in 1916, leaving their plot to seize Mexico unfulfilled. Pascual Orozco leaves a complex legacy. Though revered by many in northern Mexico, his hometown is now called San Isidro Pascual Orozco after all. He is condemned by many historians of the Mexican Revolution as a traitor who aligned himself with the man who quashed the return of Mexican democracy. Figures such as Villa and Zapata would be more easily celebrated in Mexican national memory. However, before then he played one of the largest roles in overthrowing the tyrant Porfirio and at least attempted to bring beneficial changes to his home state of Chihuahua. His turn to becoming a counter-revolutionary was motivated partly by pragmatic compromise to at least improve his home state. Other revolutionaries such as Villa and Zapata also arguably put their home regions above Mexico at large. Orozco died in the middle of the revolution, meaning others would define the conflict to its end. Thank you for watching this episode of Historical Detour. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and consider joining my Patreon for exclusive perks. Farewell.